Do humans have free will? Now, this will be an evaluation of neuroscientific takes on free will, more specifically, in this case, the Libet experiments. In the philosophical discourse, this question has long been discussed with approaches even dating back to the ancient Greece. In neuroscientific research, however, this question has only gained prominence in the last century, in particular since the physiologist Benjamin Libet published his Libet experiments at the end of the 70s, start of the 80s. In this short presentation, I'm aiming at providing a brief overview of Libet experiments to then touch upon some major issues that have been pointed out with regard to the implications for free will that have been drawn from the results. So Libet was interested in the neural activity underlying intentional acts. He therefore designed an experiment which allowed him to record neural activity while subjects were performing a voluntary movement and subsequently had to indicate the time of their conscious decision to act. With the use of an EEG, Libet was able to detect so-called readiness potentials, or RPs in short. These were essentially potential changes measured on the scalp of the subject, which functioned as an electrophysiological indicator of neuronal activity. Libet argues that these potential changes are the origin or neural basis of the voluntary movement or the decision thereof. In general, the experiment he conducted in 1982, which I'm describing here, was already a modified version of the original one he published 3 years prior to this one. Here he tried to account for critical aspects that were brought up against his former experimental design, such as placing a time constraint on subjects. Therefore, this time, subjects were completely free to choose the time of action with no specific time interval prescribed to them. Besides that, they were given the option to blink if necessary in order to avoid such external impulsion. In total, there were 6 right-handed subjects, 4 female and 2 male college students. They were split into 2 groups, while the second group participated in the study a few months after the first one. Each subject attended 6 to 8 regular half-day sessions, with 1 per week, comprising 2 40-trial series of self-initiated acts. During each of these sessions, subjects were connected to an EEG device with which the formerly mentioned readiness potentials were obtained and averaged to so-called ERPs. In addition to that, subjects were connected to an EMG, which recorded the muscle movement of the finger if a certain threshold was reached. This determined the time 0, the time of the voluntary movement, used as a fixed point on the basis of which the readiness potentials can be averaged. This is an important step, called back-averaging, as it allows to discern the event-correlated neural activity from noise. For each trial, subjects were asked to relax their muscles and fix their gaze on the center of the screen. The experimenter then activated a fast revolving clock depicted on the screen, which took 2.56 seconds instead of the usual 60 seconds for one full revolution. From now on, it was up to the subject when to perform a spontaneous, quick, and abrupt flexion of their finger. Right after the voluntary movement, they were then to indicate the position of the clock that corresponded to the moment in which they were aware of the intention to perform the act. During the first trials with Group 1, the experimenters noticed a necessity for some changes. For the last few trials in Group 1 and for the entire Group 2, the experimenters additionally gave the instruction to encourage a spontaneous movement in order to avoid pre-planning, and, subsequent to the trials, they then asked the subjects whether they were aware of any pre-planning. The results of the experiment showed that the reported decision to act approximated to around 200 milliseconds prior to the action. Further, the results gave rise to a distinction between 3 different readiness potentials. The type 1 readiness potential seemed closely associated with the occurrence of some pre-planning right before the act. It therefore had its onset more than 700 milliseconds prior to the voluntary movement already. The type 2 readiness potential is the interesting one, which Libet regards as the neural basis of the spontaneous, voluntary act without the influence of pre-planning. On average, it appeared about 550 milliseconds before the voluntary movement, and thus roughly 350 milliseconds before the subjects became aware of the intention to act. The third type refers to another trial series which Libet also tested, in which subjects did not have to decide on their own, but rather a skin stimulus led to the movement. To no surprise, the potential appears a lot later than the former two. The graph you can see on the right here depicts the 3 readiness potentials, wherein A refers to type 1, B to type 2, and C to type 3. The vertical lines in each column represent time zero, so the time of movement, and the dashed horizontal lines refer to the baseline activity. Each row depicts the already averaged readiness potentials of 3 subjects respectively. From these findings, some people have concluded that free will does not exist. In order to act freely, they reason, we need to have conscious control over our decisions and the ability to voluntarily act according to them. Since Libet experiments suggest that our conscious decisions are already determined by neural mechanisms before we become aware of the decision, the existence of free will may be in question. Libet himself regarded his findings as evidence for the claim that our volitional processes are initiated unconsciously through neural activity, about 350 to 400 milliseconds before we become aware of the decision resulting from those processes. Contrary to many other researchers, as mentioned a few seconds ago, he does not conclude that free will is an illusion. In a paper published in 1999, he speaks of a conscious veto, which could potentially allow the conscious to exert control over the outcome of the determined decision, and thus, for example, counteract. In the philosophical debate especially, these experiments and their apparent implications have faced quite some criticism, and I will only touch upon some of them here briefly. First of all, Bain noted in 2011 the subjects had to divide their attention between 2 perceptual streams. They had to attend to their own agency on the one hand, to notice the urge or intention to act, while at the same time attending to the revolving clock in order to recall the time of their intention to act. This could impact the accuracy of the indicated time. And in addition to that, Dannett and Kinsburn outline another critical factor that could distort the accurate recall of the time. Research suggests that the experience of, in this case the urge or intention to act, does not necessarily contain an accurate representation of the temporal property of that experience. So the content of the experience might have a different temporal representation than the actual time at which the experience occurred. One of the most prominent criticisms against Libet's experiments question whether the readiness potentials are actually the neural basis of the voluntary actions. The method that has to be used in order to discern the potentials from noise, called back-averaging, leads to one major downside. The muscle movement recorded by the MEG functions as a fixed point on the basis of which the readiness potentials prior to the fixed point are normed. Any readiness potential that does not follow in action simply cannot be measured. One further finding from 1999 allows for an alternative explanation for what's the neural basis of voluntary acts. Haggard and Eimer found that lateralized readiness potentials, so ones that are restricted to only one of the 2 hemispheres, contralateral to the bodily side of the movement, are coupled more strongly to the agency and at the same time are temporally closer to the awareness of the intention. So, as you can see, there are quite a few issues that don't allow for an easy conclusion as to whether humans have free will or not. I hope this was an interesting little insight into the neuroscientific debate on free will. Thank you for your interest.